Jane stood at her kitchen window, watching as the bulldozer rumbled toward her front yard, its engine a low growl that seemed to vibrate through her bones. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, but the peaceful scene was marred by the unmistakable sound of destruction. The large metal claw of the bulldozer loomed over her prized rain garden, her labor of love for the last 2 years. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the window frame, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent hours researching, planning, and carefully selecting the native plants that now thrived in the garden. It was no ordinary patch of flowers. It was a carefully designed system to capture rainwater, preventing flooding in a neighborhood already prone to heavy storms. It had been her passion project, something that could make a real difference, not just for her home, but for the entire block. And now it was about to be destroyed. "Jane, don't," her husband, Mark, said quietly from behind her. He stepped into the kitchen, his face drawn, his eyes tired. He had been fighting the HOA's demands for weeks, but the board had made it clear that the garden didn't meet their aesthetic standards. They had given her an ultimatum: remove the garden or face fines. The HOA had sent countless letters, held meetings, and made it impossible to reason with them. But Jane had refused to back down. This garden wasn't just about beauty, it was about sustainability. The water had nowhere to go without it. Her garden was a natural solution to a growing problem. And yet she was forced to watch it be torn apart by an overzealous bulldozer. The operator revved the engine, and the mechanical arm swung forward, its claws ready to level the plants. Jane's stomach twisted in knots. "I can't watch this," she whispered, more to herself than to Mark. But Mark didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the scene outside, his face grim. "If we don't do something, they'll keep taking away what's ours. First the garden, then what? Our homes." His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Before Jane could respond, the bulldozer's arm swung down with a deafening crash, ripping through the earth and uprooting the first of the delicate wildflowers. The plants, flowers that had been a safe haven for bees, butterflies, and birds, were crushed beneath the weight of the machine. She watched in horror as the earth was torn apart, the drainage system she had worked so hard to install being shredded and ripped from the ground. Her breath hitched. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the bulldozer doing its work. The destruction of her garden felt like the end of something that, at its core, had been about hope. Hope for a greener future, hope for a safer environment. It was all slipping away in front of her. And then, as if on cue, the first raindrops began to fall. Light at first, then harder, faster. The heavens opening up, sending a rush of water that began to soak the soil, pooling where her garden had once stood. Jane's chest tightened as she realized the inevitable. The rainwater that had once been absorbed by her garden was now free to wash away everything in its path. She stared out the window, dread clawing at her. The sky darkened as the storm intensified, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. Was it too late? Could anyone else see what she saw? Or was this just the beginning? Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her gut. The bulldozer rumbled on, oblivious to the storm gathering not just in the skies above, but in the very foundation of their neighborhood. The storm intensified throughout the night. Jane lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the rhythmic pounding of rain on the roof doing little to calm the unease that knotted her stomach. She couldn't shake the image of her rain garden being torn apart, of the fragile plants, the tiny droplets of hope she had nurtured, vanishing beneath the bulldozer's cold, relentless grip. She tried to tell herself it was just a garden, that it could be replaced. But deep down, she knew this was about more than just plants. This was about something bigger, something that now felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The morning after the destruction, the air was thick with tension. Jane stood at her front door, watching the remnants of her once beautiful garden. A crushed heap of soil, broken stems, and uprooted roots. The storm had passed, but the damage had only just begun. As the floodwaters slowly receded, Jane knew the next storm could bring even more devastation, and without the garden, she had no idea what would hold the water back. But the real blow came when the HOA sent her another letter. The official-looking envelope was thick, embossed with the HOA's gold seal. Jane's stomach dropped as she tore it open. The letter was brief but to the point. Violation of HOA landscaping guidelines. Immediate removal required. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. She stared at the words, the anger bubbling up inside her like a pot about to boil over. The HOA had already bulldozed her garden. What more did they want from her? She didn't have to read between the lines. The HOA had made their stance clear. The rain garden wasn't just an eyesore in their view. It was a direct challenge to their authority, to their vision of what the neighborhood should look like. To them, it was a mess of wildflowers and unkempt grass. But to Jane, it had been a lifeline. Without it, the flooding in her neighborhood would worsen, and if she couldn't make the HOA understand that, the consequences would be far-reaching. By noon, she had arrived at the HOA's office, the papers in her hand clenched into a fist. She had been here before, sitting in countless meetings where she quietly listened to the board drone on about aesthetics and neighborhood uniformity. But today was different. Today, Jane wasn't going to sit silently. Today, she was going to make them listen. The boardroom was quiet as Jane entered, her steps echoing on the polished floors. Mr. Daniels, the HOA president, sat at the head of the table, his steely eyes meeting hers with an unreadable gaze. He had always been a stickler for rules, but there was something about him now that felt calculating, like he already knew what was coming and was ready to shut it down before she even had a chance to speak. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Owens," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something cold. "I trust you're here to discuss the ongoing issues with your rain garden." Jane's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm here to explain why this garden is necessary," she said, her voice steady despite the fire raging inside her. She spread out a stack of research papers, each one detailing the benefits of rain gardens, how they prevented runoff, how they could stabilize the ground, how they made communities more resilient to flooding. This garden wasn't just for me. It was for the whole neighborhood. It helped manage stormwater and reduce flooding risk, something this community needs. Mr. Daniels didn't even glance at the papers. "Mrs. Owens, we appreciate your enthusiasm for environmental causes, but this isn't about the environment. This is about maintaining property values and upholding the standards of our community. Your garden is a violation of the HOA's rules, and we've made it clear that it must be removed." Jane's breath hitched. "You're not listening to me," she exclaimed. The garden was helping to prevent flooding. Without it, this neighborhood is going to face worse damage, real damage, when the next storm hits. You don't understand what you've done. The tension in the room thickened. The other board members, sitting around the table, exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. No one spoke. Mr. Daniels folded his arms and leaned back in his chair, his gaze unyielding. "That's enough," he said, cutting her off. "You've been warned, Mrs. Owens. If the garden is not removed, we will take further action. Your personal feelings about the matter will not change the rules." Jane felt a surge of helplessness. She had fought for so long, hoping they would see reason. But they wouldn't. They weren't listening. The truth of it hit her like a punch to the gut. They didn't care. She left the meeting with a sense of finality, but also an unnerving feeling that the storm wasn't just outside. It was closing in on her, and soon it would swallow everyone in the neighborhood whole, and she might not be able to stop it. The day was colder than Jane expected. The early morning light seemed muted, as if even the sun hesitated to shine after the storm that had passed through the night before. She stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at the bulldozer parked just beyond her lawn. The heavy machinery loomed like a predator, its massive metal claws ready to crush what was left of her rain garden into the earth. It was a moment Jane had feared, But she never imagined she'd be forced to witness it in such a cold, unceremonious way. She had expected the worst when she saw the bulldozer the day before, but now that it was finally here, the reality felt worse than she could have imagined. The morning air was still, almost eerily quiet. Not even a bird dared to make a sound. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Jane's eyes followed the figure of the operator as he climbed into the cabin of the bulldozer. His face was hidden behind the tinted glass, but she didn't need to see it to know what he was about to do. He revved the engine, and the rumble shook her chest. She felt a surge of anger rise in her throat, but she swallowed it back. There was nothing she could do now. The HOA had won. She had fought as hard as she could, presenting case studies, hiring experts, trying to convince the board that the rain garden was essential not just for her yard, but for the entire community. She had even tried to appeal to their sense of reason, explaining that removing it could lead to significant water runoff problems, flooding, erosion, damage to homes. But it had all fallen on deaf ears. The operator lifted the bulldozer's massive claw and positioned it directly over the first section of her garden, the bed of native wildflowers that had been a sanctuary for bees and butterflies. The flowers, so carefully selected and nurtured, were about to be obliterated in a single stroke. Jane's hands shook as she pressed them against the cold window. Her heart thudded in her chest, matching the rhythm of the bulldozer's engine. She could already see the fragile stems, vibrant petals, and the intricate root system vanishing beneath the powerful, unrelenting machine. "Don't," she whispered, but the word was lost in the sound of the engine roaring to life. The bulldozer moved forward. With one swift motion, the claw plunged into the earth. The ground trembled as it tore through the soil, uprooting her plants, tearing the garden apart with a grotesque efficiency. Jane's breath caught in her throat as she saw the bright yellow petals of a wildflower shredded beneath the treads. The entire landscape, once so carefully constructed, was now being flattened before her eyes. She pressed her palm harder against the glass, as if she could somehow stop the machine with her will alone. But it was no use. The destruction was happening too fast, and her heart was breaking with every passing second. The water that had once been absorbed by the rain garden now pooled in the bare patch of earth, spreading out like a spreading stain of doom. As she watched, her mind raced. Could she do something? Could she run out there and scream at them to stop? She considered it for a moment, but then the thought of the HOA's ever-present enforcers, the eyes and ears that watched the neighborhood like hawks, made her hesitate. They would call the police, accuse her of trespassing or interfering with a contractor. She would be the one in trouble. And deep down, Jane knew that no one would listen, not now. Not when the garden had been bulldozed. The operator didn't even pause. The plants, the soil, the entire structure of the rain garden was being destroyed, obliterated without so much as a second glance. As the machine backed up, Jane noticed something. A faint crack in the soil just beneath the bulldozer's path, a slight shift in the earth. Her pulse quickened. The shift was barely noticeable, but it was there. She couldn't tell what it meant, but it felt wrong. There was a sense of imbalance, as if the earth itself was unsettled, and not just because of the garden's destruction. The operator moved to the next section, continuing the destruction without a thought. But Jane couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something bigger was at play. The ground, now stripped bare of its once vital vegetation, seemed to groan beneath the weight of the bulldozer, as though it was protesting the violence being done to it. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled down the street, making the trees sway dangerously. Jane's chest tightened. She stared at the hill that sloped gently downhill from her yard to the homes below. In that moment, she understood the worst-case scenario. The land wasn't just being stripped of its beauty, it was being stripped of its stability. Without the rain garden to manage the runoff, everything would shift. The erosion that Jane had warned the HOA about would only get worse. And that was just the beginning. The operator finished his task, the final stroke of the bulldozer's claw flattening the last remnants of her garden. But as Jane stood there, Her eyes still fixed on the spot where her garden had been, she couldn't shake the sense that this was only the start. The damage done here, to her garden, to the landscape, was more than just aesthetic. It was the first crack in the foundation of the neighborhood itself. The storm was coming, and with it, something far worse than anything she had imagined. The rain had stopped by mid-afternoon, but the damage had been done. Jane stood in the empty yard, her eyes still glued to the spot where her garden used to be. The soil was exposed now, raw and vulnerable to the elements. The earth felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. But she couldn't just stand there. She had to leave, to figure out what was happening to the neighborhood, but the unease gnawed at her as she walked back inside the house. By the time the sky had turned to dusk, the first signs of disaster started to unfold. Jane had been scrolling through emails, trying to distract herself, when the ground beneath her feet trembled. At first, it was subtle, a slight vibration, nothing more than a trick of her senses. But then it came again, stronger this time. She froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What was that? A low rumble reached her ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of cracking and splintering wood. Her heart lurched in her chest as the noise grew louder, more intense. She rushed to the window, throwing open the blinds, just in time to see something that made her blood run cold. One of her neighbors' homes, a quaint two-story with ivy crawling up the brick walls, was beginning to shift. It was as though the foundation had suddenly decided to give way, the entire house lurching backward with a horrible groan. The ground beneath it had begun to crack open, large fissures snaking through the earth like angry veins. "God, no," Jane whispered, her throat tightening with panic. She could barely believe what she was seeing. The house began to lean, ever so slightly at first, then with growing speed as more of the hillside crumbled beneath it. The once sturdy foundation was crumbling, sinking downward like a slow-motion avalanche, taking the driveway and a portion of the yard with it. Frantically, Jane grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number of her neighbor, Karen, whose house was at the base of the hill. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. "Karen, it's Jane," she said breathlessly. "Call me, please. There's something wrong. Your house, it's..." The connection cut off, leaving only the ringing of the line in her ear. She rushed outside, barely aware of the cold biting at her skin. As she crossed the street, her mind raced. The erosion. She had warned them about the erosion. Without her rain garden, there was nothing to hold back the water, nothing to keep the hillside intact. The runoff from the storm had become a force of nature, carving into the soft earth, and now it was taking entire homes with it. The crack in the ground below her own house had grown wider. The once solid soil beneath her feet now felt precarious, like the earth itself was ready to slide away. She could feel the subtle tilt in the ground, a sinking sensation that seemed to spread with every passing second. She tried to steady herself, but the ground trembled again, this time more violently. The sensation of the hill shifting was unmistakable. Panic surged through her veins, and for the first time, she wondered if she would be able to stop it. Racing back inside, Jane grabbed a flashlight and dashed out to the backyard, her mind spinning as she tried to think of any way to prevent the inevitable. But as she reached the back gate and looked down toward the slope, her stomach dropped. The damage was spreading, just like she had feared. The entire hillside was starting to give way, slowly but surely. The once stable ground, now exposed to the storm's wrath, had begun to erode, each trickle of water loosening more soil, pulling more earth down with it. It wasn't just Karen's house anymore. The entire street, all the way down to the cul-de-sac, was in danger. Jane's eyes darted across the neighborhood. The homes that were built too close to the hill, their foundations now exposed to the unchecked runoff, were all at risk. And Jane realized with a sickening jolt, her house was next. The ground beneath her started to vibrate again, this time more violently. She could hear the sound of cracking, like the earth itself was splitting. Her knees went weak, and she stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. Was she about to lose everything? As she watched the hillside crumble, her mind raced back to the morning the bulldozer had come. That moment, that feeling of something ominous in the air, now made sense. It wasn't just a garden being destroyed. It was the beginning of the end. The damage had begun, and it was only going to get worse. The sounds of cracking wood and crumbling earth echoed through the neighborhood, but Jane's mind was fixated on one thing: survival. She could see the hillside beginning to collapse in slow motion. Houses, yards, and driveways slipping into the earth like a nightmare that wouldn't stop. It was all happening so fast. How had it come to this? As she stood in her backyard, staring at the unstable ground beneath her feet, her thoughts scrambled for a way out. She couldn't wait any longer. If the damage spread any further, it wouldn't be just the lower homes at risk. The entire neighborhood could be swallowed up, one house after another, until the whole hillside was nothing but rubble. Without the rain garden, the water had no place to go. The soil, once held together by the plants she had carefully chosen, had become a sponge, soaked and weakened by the storm. Jane's stomach twisted as the realization hit her. The HOA had condemned her garden, but in doing so, they had condemned the entire block. Panic clawed at her throat. She needed help. Fast. But who would listen now? The HOA had dismissed her warnings, turning a blind eye to the consequences of their actions. She had tried to appeal to them, but they wouldn't even acknowledge the environmental disaster unfolding before them. The board had been so focused on appearances, so obsessed with maintaining the look of the neighborhood, that they had disregarded the very thing that kept the earth from slipping away. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Karen, her neighbor whose house had been sinking only moments earlier. "Jane, get to the bottom of the hill. Now. Something's happening. It's getting worse." Jane's breath caught in her throat as she read the message. The warning was clear. What had started with Karen's house was only the beginning. If the water had begun to erode the base of the hill, it wasn't just the homes near the bottom that were at risk. It was the entire neighborhood. Without hesitation, Jane turned and ran toward the front of her house, ignoring the shiver of fear that crept up her spine. She didn't care if she was about to be caught by the HOA's enforcers or fined again. Her neighborhood was on the brink of disaster, and she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she raced down the street, her eyes fixed on the growing cracks in the earth. The entire hill was shifting. And just as her mind tried to process the enormity of it, something caught her eye. Another house, farther down the hill, was beginning to list to one side. She could hear the creaking of its foundation giving way. The ground beneath it, where the soil had once been fortified by trees, shrubs, and Jane's rain garden, was now rapidly giving way. The house tilted at an unnatural angle before, with a horrifying sound. It started to slide down the slope. A wave of dread washed over Jane. This was worse than she had imagined. The entire hill was destabilizing, and with every house that slid, the damage would only escalate. It was like a domino effect, and she was powerless to stop it. She reached the bottom of the hill, gasping for breath, and turned her eyes toward Karen's house. The sight was worse than she had expected. Not only had the foundation cracked and shifted, but the ground beneath the house had begun to buckle, splitting into large chunks. The home was tilting dangerously, leaning toward the abyss below. Karen's car, parked in the driveway, had already slid partway down the hill, its wheels spinning uselessly in the mud. Karen, standing frozen on her porch, looked as if she were in shock. "Karen," Jane called, her voice hoarse. "We need to get out. Now." Karen didn't move, her gaze locked on the house that was slowly sliding down into the valley below. Her lips trembled as she whispered, I don't know what to do. What happened? Why is this happening?" "I don't know," Jane said, the reality of the situation hitting her all at once. "But we have to move fast. The whole hill is coming down, and we need to get to higher ground before." Before she could finish, another loud rumble shook the air. and Jane stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance as the earth beneath her feet shuddered. The ground had tilted further. The entire street was tilting. Without thinking, Jane grabbed Karen's arm and pulled her away from the house, forcing her to move. "We have to run," Jane urged, her voice shaking. They sprinted toward the more stable part of the neighborhood, but Jane knew it wasn't enough. The damage was spreading. This wasn't just a localized problem. It was a full-blown disaster, one that could cost them everything. And in the back of her mind, a chilling thought kept repeating itself. It's too late to fix this. As she ran, Jane's heart pounded louder than the thunder that had begun to rumble in the distance. The storm wasn't over. The real storm, the one that could tear their homes apart, had only just begun. The ground beneath Jane's feet trembled again, sending ripples of fear through her veins. She could feel the weight of the earth shifting beneath her, a slow, insidious pull that seemed to drag everything downward with it. The devastation was spreading faster than she had anticipated. There was no time left to waste. She glanced back at the neighborhood, her heart sinking as she saw the full extent of the damage. Several houses, some already half sunken into the earth, were teetering on the edge, as if the land itself was swallowing them whole. Jane's throat tightened. Every home she had known for years, every street corner where children used to play, was now a ticking time bomb, waiting to collapse. Karen stumbled beside her, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How can we fix this?" "We can't," Jane replied, her words laced with grim finality. "Not by ourselves. But we can still save the others. There's a chance to get out. The emergency evacuation routes are on the other side of the hill. We need to warn the others before it's too late." They were running now, adrenaline coursing through their bodies, their footsteps echoing in the quiet of the disaster-stricken neighborhood. Jane knew the clock was ticking. Each second that passed meant more homes slipping into the abyss. As they reached the next intersection, Jane spotted a group of neighbors gathered in front of the community center. They were in a dazed huddle, some frantically dialing their phones, others staring wide-eyed at the devastation unfolding around them. But there was no one from the HOA in sight, no one to help them. The same board members who had dismissed her warnings were nowhere to be found. "Do they even care?" Jane muttered under her breath, her fists clenching at her sides. Karen shook her head, her voice filled with disbelief. "They never listened. None of them did. I can't believe it." It was as if the earth had turned against them. Jane knew, deep down, that this wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just a bad storm or a freak occurrence. The removal of her rain garden, her garden that had been the neighborhood's natural defense, had caused the chain reaction. The HOA had been too blinded by their rules, their obsession with uniformity, to see the bigger picture. The sky above them had darkened once more, the clouds thickening ominously. Another storm was brewing, and this one would be far worse than the last. Jane felt a sharp pang of dread. If they didn't act now, the entire hill might collapse by morning. The emergency sirens finally blared from a distance, signaling the evacuation had begun. But Jane wasn't sure they had enough time. She pushed through the crowd of neighbors, her voice rising over the din. "Everyone, listen. Get to higher ground. Now, the hill is giving way. And if we don't move, we won't make it out in time." People looked at her with confusion, some skeptical, others in a daze as the full scale of the disaster settled in. Jane grabbed Karen's hand and pulled her toward the road. "We need to move before it's too late." As they ran toward the evacuation point, Jane's thoughts churned. She knew this wasn't just about saving lives. It was about accountability. The HOA had ignored the warnings, had bulldozed something that had kept this place safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very thing they had destroyed was the only line of defense they had against what was now barreling toward them. Then, just as they rounded the corner toward the evacuation buses, the earth shook violently beneath them. Jane felt the ground crack open beneath her, and she stumbled, barely catching herself as she heard a sickening sound, the unmistakable groan of another house, this time just a few feet away, as it gave way to the earth. The sight made Jane's blood run cold. The house tilted, groaning as it shifted, and before she could blink, the entire structure slipped downward, crashing into the valley below. A scream tore from her throat. It was happening faster than she could process, faster than she had ever feared. There was no way to stop it now. She had to get everyone to safety. But as Jane looked over her shoulder, her heart sank. The road was crumbling. The landslide was coming closer, spreading like a dark wave, its power too great to escape. The buses were still parked at the base of the hill, waiting to take people to safety, but Jane knew it wouldn't be enough. The hill was coming down in pieces, and the wave of destruction was too great to outrun. "We need to get to the high school," Jane shouted. "It's the only safe place left." She and Karen led the small group of neighbors toward the main road, but just as they reached the edge of the evacuation route, a deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the entire section of road ahead of them buckled, falling away into the growing chasm. Panic erupted, but Jane wasn't about to let fear take over. She grabbed Karen's hand. "We're going to make it," she said, her voice shaking but determined. But the ground was shifting too quickly, and as Jane watched the last sliver of the road disappear beneath them, she realized just how true her worst fear had been. This wasn't just about her garden anymore. It was about the survival of an entire neighborhood teetering on the brink of collapse. The sound of the earth cracking open was like a monstrous growl, deafening in its intensity. Jane's heart thundered in her chest as she sprinted ahead, her feet barely touching the ground. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run faster, to push herself harder, but the reality of the situation crashed down around her. The hillside, which had once stood so tall and proud, was now a disaster zone, an unstable, crumbling slope threatening to devour everything in its path. The road ahead had fractured and split, revealing a gaping wound in the earth, as if the land itself had been torn apart. The emergency sirens blared louder now, a constant, shrill reminder that time was slipping away. But the danger was too great, the landslide too close. Jane barely heard Karen's voice calling out behind her. She could see the high school in the distance, standing strong like a fortress, a beacon of hope amid the chaos. They had to make it there. That was their only chance. The small group of neighbors behind them were panicked, their faces pale with fear. Some of them stumbled, too disoriented to keep up with Jane's frantic pace. Jane glanced over her shoulder, a cold fear gripping her as she saw the earth tremble beneath them again. The landslide had reached the bottom of the hill, and the ground was buckling under the weight of the destruction. "Come on, keep going," she shouted, urging the others forward. "We're almost there, just a little farther." But as they pushed forward, another loud crack split the air. Jane's heart skipped a beat as she saw a massive tree uprooted from the hillside, its roots exposed to the sky. The tree fell with a terrifying crash, barreling down toward the road where they had just been. Jane's stomach dropped as she realized how close they had come to the edge. If they hadn't moved just in time, they would have been swept away with the debris. "Karen, we have to move faster," Jane shouted, grabbing her friend's arm and pulling her forward. They were so close now. Jane could feel the heat of the evacuation buses waiting at the base of the school, could almost hear the shouts of the emergency crews preparing for their arrival. But then, just as the high school came into view, something terrible happened. A deafening rumble tore through the air, and Jane felt her legs give way beneath her. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently, sending her crashing to the dirt. She barely had time to react before the ground cracked wide open, a deep fissure splitting the earth between her and the others. "Jane!" Karen screamed, her voice filled with panic as she tried to reach out. But Jane's vision blurred as she struggled to regain her balance. The landslide was now racing toward them with brutal force, the earth collapsing under the weight of everything above it. Jane could see the destruction cascading down like an unstoppable wave. Houses, trees, everything tumbling into the abyss. The ground beneath her continued to tremble, and Jane's body was thrust forward as the entire hillside seemed to shift beneath her. She reached out, desperate to grab hold of something, anything, but her fingers scraped the edge of a jagged rock just out of reach. Time seemed to slow as the ground buckled beneath her again. And then, silence. The world around her seemed to pause, frozen in an instant of sheer terror. But then the deafening roar of the earth collapsing surged back with a vengeance. The landslide reached them in an explosive wave, sweeping everything in its path. Jane felt herself being pulled toward the chasm as the ground beneath her collapsed completely. Her heart pounded in her chest, a primal fear taking over as the weight of the earth dragged her toward the void. But just as she was about to lose her grip, something incredible happened. A strong hand wrapped around her wrist, yanking her back from the precipice. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it, hallucinating in the chaos. But the grip was real, and the voice that called her name was unmistakable. Jane, hold on. She looked up, wide-eyed and gasping for breath, to see a figure, Karen. Her friend's face was streaked with dirt and fear, but she wasn't letting go. Pull. Come on. Karen grunted, using every ounce of strength to pull Jane back from the edge. Jane's hands scrambled for purchase, her fingers clawing at the rocks beneath her, but the earth around them was breaking apart, the edge slipping lower with each second. Karen's eyes met hers, and for a split second, Jane could see the terror mirrored in her friend's face. But there was something else there too, determination. With a final heave, Karen yanked Jane to safety, pulling her clear of the crumbling ground. Jane gasped for air, her chest heaving with the shock of the close call. She lay flat on the ground for a moment, disoriented, feeling the tremors beneath her as the landslide continued its deadly descent. Then, with a harsh breath, she scrambled to her feet. The ground beneath them was still shaking, but they had no time to waste. The hill was coming down piece by piece, and if they didn't move now, they'd be trapped. "Run," Jane shouted, her voice hoarse with urgency. "We have to go now." Together, they sprinted toward the high school, the sound of destruction still echoing behind them. As they neared the school's gates, the chaos around them only intensified. The ground continued to tremble, and the roar of the landslide grew louder, like a monstrous tide crashing down from above. But the high school was close, so close, and with every ounce of strength she had left, Jane kept running. She could see the lights of the evacuation buses in the distance, the last glimmer of hope before the world around them collapsed entirely. As they crossed the threshold into the high school's parking lot, Jane turned to look back one last time. Her stomach churned as she saw the hill that had once been home, now nothing but a massive, jagged scar on the landscape. The destruction had only just begun. But they had made it. For now, at least. But in the pit of Jane's stomach, a gnawing sense of dread remained. The worst was yet to come. The sound of the evacuation sirens blared in Jane's ears as she staggered toward the shelter inside the high school. She could still feel the tremors beneath her feet, the earth rumbling like a beast in fury. The ground beneath them had buckled and shifted violently, and in the distance, the distant roar of destruction echoed like a death knell. But Jane couldn't let herself look back. Not yet. She scanned the parking lot, where emergency responders were ushering neighbors into buses, their faces filled with exhaustion, panic, and disbelief. The air felt thick with tension, the weight of everything that had just happened hanging over them like an impenetrable cloud. And amidst all the chaos, Jane felt her legs threaten to give out, her body trembling from the adrenaline crash. Beside her, Karen was still breathing hard, her clothes caked in dirt, her face streaked with streaks of grime and fear. But her eyes, though wide with shock, had a quiet strength in them. Jane could see it. Her friend wasn't going to break. Not now. As they made their way toward the shelter, Jane couldn't suppress the flood of thoughts that gripped her mind. They had survived, yes, But the reality of what had just occurred was sinking in. The landslide wasn't just a freak disaster. It was a direct result of everything that had been ignored, of the HOA's blind refusal to see the consequences of their actions. Her rain garden had been bulldozed, and now the very hill they had called home had been devoured by the earth. She looked around at the others gathered near the buses, each face etched with the same horror and disbelief. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years were now scattered, some with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Jane's heart squeezed painfully as she thought of the families who had lost everything, their homes swallowed by the very land that had once held them together. And then there were the unanswered questions, the truths she still didn't know. Was it really just the garden that had caused this, or had something else been wrong all along? But Jane knew one thing for certain. The HOA's negligence had set this entire nightmare in motion. They had pushed her, silenced her warnings, and in doing so, they had condemned their own neighborhood. As Jane moved toward the bus, her mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next. "What happens now?" Karen asked, her voice quiet but steady as she fell into step beside her. "We have to make sure they're held accountable," Jane said, her voice more sure now than it had ever been. "The HOA, they need to answer for this, for everything." Karen nodded, her eyes glinting with resolve. "You're right. They need to pay for what they've done." As they boarded the bus, Jane's gaze lingered on the hillside in the distance. What had once been a lush, thriving landscape was now a wasteland of twisted trees and broken homes. It felt as though the earth itself had rebelled against the injustice that had been done to it. Her thoughts were interrupted when an official-looking figure stepped onto the bus, clipboard in hand. It was a member of the emergency response team, his face serious, his voice calm but urgent. "We're moving everyone to a temporary shelter now," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "We'll have food, medical care, and shelter, but the real work begins tomorrow. We need to start assessing the damage, and we need your full cooperation to understand what happened here." As he spoke, Jane's mind drifted back to that morning, to the bulldozer that had rumbled through her rain garden, to the HOA's dismissive attitude. They had known. They had all known that this was a possibility. "What about the HOA?" Jane asked, her voice rising slightly. "Are they going to take responsibility for this?" The official hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question, before finally speaking. "We'll investigate, but it's not going to be easy. There are a lot of legal procedures involved, a lot of red tape." "Red tape," Jane's voice sharpened with frustration. "People are dead. People have lost everything. And you're talking about red tape." The official's eyes flickered briefly with something like guilt, but he said nothing further, only nodding as he moved on to the next part of the bus. Jane's anger burned hot, but she quickly forced it back down. She couldn't let it consume her. Not yet. There was too much at stake now. They needed answers, and the battle for justice wasn't over. It had just begun. As the bus doors closed behind them, Jane felt an uneasy tension settling over the group. The future felt uncertain, the road ahead shrouded in fog. The land that had once held their homes was now a shattered graveyard of memories. But Jane knew one thing. She couldn't let the HOA escape scot-free. Not after everything they had caused. The high school parking lot filled with the sound of the buses revving their engines as they prepared to transport the displaced residents to temporary shelters. But in the back of Jane's mind, the seeds of something bigger were beginning to take root. A plan. A fight. Something that would hold the HOA accountable for the lives they had ruined. As the bus pulled away from the wreckage of her once peaceful neighborhood, Jane made a silent promise to herself. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The truth had to come out, and she would see to it that it did, no matter the cost.